I'm happy to be speaking to Nick Hewlett today, professor of French Studies at the University of Warwick, about his book, Blood and Progress, Violence in Pursuit of Emancipation. And there are so many things that I'd like to ask you, Nick, particularly the way that you look at various violent episodes in human history, contemporary and historical, communist and capitalist. But first, maybe you can say a little bit about what got you started in this subject itself. At what point did you realize you wanted to write a book that related to and explored violence?
Well, I suppose we take for granted, and certainly the media takes, often the mainstream media anyway, takes for granted that certain forms of violence are legitimate, and these tend to be wars, well, they tend to be wars perpetrated by Western states, and other forms of violence are illegitimate, and these tend to be violence perpetrated by people who are often described as terrorists, at least at the time. As we know, one day's terrorist is the next day, or the next day, decade anyways, freedom fighter. But it is that sort of thing that got me interested in it. And wondering whether there wasn't a more subtle framework within which we should be looking at the question of violence.
And you use Marxism as a way of approaching it as one framework. And I'm curious, because it makes a lot of sense, the contradictions that Marx talks about, and so the inevitable sort of fights between two sides makes a lot of sense to use as a framework. I'm curious whether you started to think about Marxism and sort of move towards violence as something you were going to think about? Or did you think about violence and then decide Marxism was a more appropriate way to approach it? So did one come first in your work?
Well, I've been working within a Marxist framework for quite a long time, and that certainly predates my particular interest in political violence. So Marxism came first. I was, however, very aware that Marx and Engels did not have a fully fledged theory of violence by any means. Engels has this rather, well, his more explicit theory of violence in Anti-Düring is a bit of a crude one, to be honest, where he more or less says, violence is inevitable, it is necessary, and it will all come all right in the end, sort of thing. I think Marx himself has a slightly more subtle approach to violence, and particularly if you look at parts of Das Kapital, you see that you see a real revulsion towards violence, particularly in periods of petty accumulation of capital. And he also talks. There's a famous chapter in Capital Volume 1 where he talks about beggars being whipped if they're caught as vagrants a second or third time, and this sort of thing. I mean, it has to be said that Engels, although I've said he has a rather crude approach to violence, it's also true that if you look at something like the condition of the working class in England, there are, on his part, there's also a real revulsion in this sort of more, what you might describe as a more documentary book, where he looks at London and condition of the poor in London and Manchester. But certainly in Engels' philosophical approach, as I say, it is very much a means and an end. In other words, the end is justified by the violent means. But nevertheless, I thought there was enough in a Marxist framework to make it valid.
And one of the things that it seems so obvious after reading it in your book, but I hadn't really explicitly thought about it, is that Marx and later Marxists, as well as many others, use violence, particularly the kind of visceral, horrible violence that may be inflicted upon groups, say the poor, working class in England, for example. They use that kind of violence to, I guess, legitimize, if I don't know if that's the right word, but to frame their violence as something that must happen to stop this kind of horrible violence. And so that seems to be a common thread in a lot of things. You look at Castro, for example, and you look at other later events in Russia, and it seems that always there is an identification of horrid violence perpetrated by the antagonist, and therefore whoever's on the other side is justified in their violence. Is that something you discovered, or is that something you were somewhat aware of? And have you found that to be the case seemingly throughout history? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that seemingly continuous process in history.
Yes, I think it is really a pretty continuous process. I mean, up until some more explicitly pacifist movements in the 20th century, in partly on the part of women and women's groups, partly on the part of Gandhi, but actually partly on the part of Castro as well, who I'll back to in a minute, if that's okay. But certainly, I think for much of history, there is this idea that there is a tit for tat. You know, if somebody is violent to you, then it's fair enough to be violent to them. I mean, there is to some extent and some interpretations of Christianity, of course, you know, turning the other cheek and so on, insist that there is a necessary to say a need to say, you know, violence has to stop here, you know, has to stop somewhere. I mean, Christians, of course, have themselves perpetrated a great deal of violence. I mean, Castro is a very interesting case. I'm not suggesting that he was an angel by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly very explicitly in writings and interviews. There's a very interesting book called My Life, which he produced in collaboration with a journalist called Ramanev. And in this autobiographical series of interviews, he talks, for example, about his influence, about the influence of Christianity on his thought. But he also describes the way in which, and this I think is borne out by other historians, historians of the Cuban Revolution. He also describes how in their guerrilla warfare in the Sierra Nevada in Cuba, they treated prisoners with a great deal of respect. This was something that was very much up front. They tended to give them medical care and then release them after they had, you know, if they were injured, after they had recovered sufficiently. And there's one rather interesting speech which is quoted by Castro in one or two places where he harangues some captives, and he says, "We are going to release you, but you should know that if you fight for the enemy, and if you're caught again," and you expect him to say, you know, "We'll kill you or we'll torture you" or something like that, but in fact he says, you know, we will capture you, we will harangue you again, and then we'll release you again. And that is quite an interesting moment. I mean, you know, there were in the Cuban Revolution, there were certainly some, for example, one or two executions which they carried out. As I say, they were not a bunch of angels. On the other hand, they were very clear that the circumstances had to be very extreme. For example, there were one or two people, I'm not justifying this incidentally, but there were one or two people they captured who were informants and were actually detailed to kill Castro, for example. And so it was in these sorts of cases where executions were carried out. What I'm doing here, I'm not, as I say, holding Castro up as an absolute model, but what I am suggesting is that there is an ethical approach to violence, or an approach which acknowledges that perhaps violence is sometimes necessary in the pursuit of emancipation, you know, to quote the subtitle of my book, but where an ethical and to some extent an approach influenced by pacifism can be brought to bear. As you know, I'm not a pacifist, and the book I wrote does not have a pacifist argument, but there's a certain influence of pacifism. And indeed, one of the main things that I argue is that emancipation actually absolutely has to involve not only liberation from whatever it is that people are fighting for, struggling for, but it has to involve a notion of non-violence as an end, as a very explicit end, but also egalitarianism, equality as a very explicit end.
Have you noticed that this kind of technique is used in news reporting more often? Because I don't know if it's just a personal anecdotal thing or if it maybe is something that other people have picked up as well, but it seems to me that when any kind of protest movement or any kind of resistance movement in whatever fashion, particularly in the last year after the election in the US, I've noticed that people are looking for the first instance of violence, and as soon as that might hit in any way, that's the focus of the protest or of the coverage of the protest as a way of seemingly delegitimizing it as soon as something violent happens. And it seems to echo what you're talking about in earlier historical moments where people would use the violence of usually the tyranny in order to justify the violence of the rebellion or something to that effect. But it seems now that it's being used, I guess you could call it in the form of power, top down, where as soon as any resistance movement or protest movement acts violent, or someone who's supposed to be part of that movement is seen to be violent, then that movement becomes delegitimized, at least in the coverage. It seems that I'm seeing that, but I'm wondering if you have noticed anything similar.
I'm not sure whether I've noticed a change in that respect, but certainly, coverage of Britain, events in Britain, the United States, France, which I follow quite closely as well. If there's any violence at all, then it, on the part of protesters, then they are portrayed as I think you're suggesting, as being completely illegitimate in what they are doing. In other words, any action which is supposedly violent is deemed to be, as I think you're suggesting, and I would agree with that, deemed to be illegitimate. But I think there's another strand to that, if I can put it like that, which is that as far as protests are concerned, violence is, actions are described as violent, which in fact I would not describe as violent, by which I mean damage against property. So I'll give you an example of that. About, I suppose it was 6 or 7 years ago, you may well have heard about this, the student fees in universities in Britain were put up a great deal, and now they're very expensive. They're about £9,000. I suppose that's about what is that? About $14,000 a year, something like that.
Yeah, so quite comparable to the US, it seems.
Yes, I think it is. Yeah. Anyway, there were quite widespread student protests about that, and at one point there was a group of students who broke some windows in a Conservative Party headquarters building. Nobody was hurt, but they did smash quite a few windows. And this was quite widely in the media described as, particularly on the television and on the radio, described as violence. As I'm not necessarily justifying those sorts of actions, but there is in my view, an enormous difference between breaking windows or even setting light to a car, as long as no one's hurt, on the one hand, and causing physical harm on the other hand. As far as I'm concerned, causing physical harm is certainly violence. Whether it's justified or not is a different question. But there's a tendency certainly to blur the boundaries between causing damage to objects on the one hand and causing injury to human beings or even animals on the other hand. And I think that's certainly something which is used. There's this very slippery distinction which is made between violence on the one hand and what I would call damage to property.
Well, and I'm wondering if you could say more about why you think it is so ingrained, I guess, at least I'm thinking about the reporting, but very much probably in the political discourses as well, that as soon as something violent is identified, that somehow delegitimizes the movement or whatever is being discussed. I've never really thought about it until reading your book, but I'm not really sure why it is that as soon as somebody anywhere is violent, that is sort of an immediate disqualification, at least in the dominant discourse. Is there a reason that you can think of, or a way that works that you can better explain?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I suppose it's because, well, the sociologist, 19th century sociologist Max Weber, famously talked about the 19th century as being the century when the state, the nation state, gradually came to have a dominance over a monopoly of legitimate violence, is the way he put it. And I suppose, we still have the idea that, I think as I suggested towards the beginning of the interview, that in the dominant discourses, anyway, as you put it, we still have the idea that what the state does is legitimate, or is usually legitimate, except when there are very extreme aberrations, and that what citizens do, if they're being violent, is illegitimate. The reason being, supposedly, that we have democratically elected a government who represents the state, or rather, the state actions are representative of the government. Therefore, what the state does, I'm putting it slightly simply, of course, but what the state does is legitimate, and what voting citizens do is illegitimate if they're being violent. So I think this is probably part of it. But the question as to why we can peacefully protest, and we're allowed to do that in a well, supposedly anyway, it's not always the case, in a liberal democracy, and why we can't protest in a violent way is an interesting question. I suppose on the whole, I would agree that in what in my view would be a much more just form of society, certainly protest would be legitimate. But I suppose it would tend to be peaceful protest that was legitimate. I think one of the questions here is that we're getting onto the question of democracy, really. In other words, do governments in a liberal democracy really represent the views and the interests of the voters? I personally would argue that liberal democracy is a very, very thin form of democracy, so that what happens within large or small corporate organizations, including universities, there's very little democratic accountability here. And, that's just an example. The economic sphere is, of course, famous for not being accountable. And, the banking crisis, I think, was in part a result of this. There's just been I'm not sure whether it's been talked about very much in the United States, but there's been an enormous corporate organization called Carillion in Britain, which has just gone bankrupt and which has done an enormous amount of work on behalf of the government. And apparently, the crisis could have been predicted. So what I'm getting at is that in very thin forms of democracy, then I think it's more likely, and I think arguably more understandable. Let's put it like that. I'm not saying it's justified, but I'm saying it's more understandable that there would be forms of violence. I mean, perhaps I should refer to what Nelson Mandela said in his autobiography, namely that it's the people who are opposing freedom fighters who set the terms, who decide how violent the struggle will be. And Mandela was quite influenced, as you know, by the notion of pacifism, including by Gandhi, of course. And I think this is a very interesting idea. In other words, he starts from the position that, and the ANC for a long time anyway, started from the position that actually a struggle for liberation should not be violent unless the people who were defending the unjust order, in the case of South Africa, the apartheid regime, of course, decided to be violent themselves. And of course, this is what happened. And I think that's a very interesting and an ethically substantiated way of looking at the question. And that these are the sorts of ways in which I think the question of violence, as I put it, violence in pursuit of emancipation, should be approached.
Well, one of the things that really struck me in the last few years is I don't know how familiar you are with the Black Lives Movement in the U.S.
A little bit, yes.
Well, I mean, the thing that I've noticed, at least in terms of the discourse and where I would use your book to help better understand what's going on, what I've noticed is that there may be videos in which a police officer is clearly, I mean, in some cases, killing with immunity from the state a black man. And because of that, once these videos start circulating, people get very upset. Obviously, this is a violence that is basically unjustifiable. And as a result of those kinds of videos being released more often, you have the Black Lives Matter movement, which is protesting this. But at certain conservative news organizations like Fox News here in the U.S., they seem to want to pose or present Black Lives Matter, the protesters or the group, as a terrorist group, or if not a terrorist group, at least as a violent group, because maybe someone will be violent in a protest or someone will be linked to violence or something to that effect. What I've noticed is that we see these videos, and the more horrendous they are, the more press coverage they get, which makes sense in terms of how the media system works. But then when we confront somebody who sees these videos and yet wants to, support the police and is maybe someone who supports a more conservative government, they'll often say something to the effect of, well, the protesters in Black Lives Matter have, broken a window, or they've done this or they've done that in terms of their protesting, and therefore it's an illegitimate cause. And it has a lot of echoes to me of something like earlier civil rights movements, where the only real way that a lot of people paid attention was not because violence was being done to black people, because everybody knew that, but the more horrendous the violence, the more people would actually pay attention until somebody would actually, make a statement that this is unacceptable, but only because the violence was particularly horrendous, not because they discovered that violence was there. And so I'm wondering, it seems to me that there's a debate about how legitimate violence works, right? As you said, Weber's idea of the use of violence being legitimate in the hands of the state seems to only work until you get pictures like at Guantanamo Bay or something to that effect, where the images can't really be justified because they're particularly violent or particularly gruesome. So is that one way in which violence can continue to be legitimate or illegitimate, at least in terms of dominant discourses, is in relation to how violent or how much force is used? Is that something that you've noticed or seen as well?
Yes, I think that there are many people who are who very much believe in liberal democracy and quite possibly believe that the state on the whole is a force for good and so on, but that there are points beyond which, in terms of violence, the state goes, and that the state is, or the police force or whatever, is clearly seen to be acting illegitimately, or the army or the secret services and so on. Black Lives Matter is a very good example of that. And as you say, the more violent these incidents tend to be, the more coverage they will get, and the less and the more troubles, the more questions are asked about the role of the police, or perhaps the role of the state more generally, in relation to black people in particular. And this is, of course, reminiscent of what happened. I don't know very much about the civil rights movement in the United States, but my understanding is certainly that some of the incidents, particularly of attacks on explicitly peaceful marches, for example, led by Martin Luther King, where very much unarmed and determinedly peaceful protesters were beaten up and in some cases killed by the police. These, of course, formed some of the turning points for the civil rights movement. And the issue of Guantanamo Bay, of course, is the same when accounts were released of torture taking place, and quite undeniably so, of course. I think these are watershed moments in the history of these types of violence, when the when the dominant powers are, if I can put it like this, exposed as being highly partial and not simply defending a peaceful status quo at all. I mean, there are possibly parallels with the way in which, to some extent anyway, in Britain, the neoliberal order is now being questioned. I mentioned this firm Carillion going bankrupt recently. There's the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, who is suddenly, and the Labour Party generally, enjoying a wave of publicity on a much more anti-neoliberal or pro-state interventionist platform than it used to. And I think this is of course partially a result of the banking crisis followed by the Great Recession, which has come in its wake. And I think this is, the sort of exposure of the state in various respects has taken place, just as it can do with regard to violence when there are clearly very excessive forms of violence. And you mentioned Black Lives Matter videos, for example. And there have been instances in Britain of that as well, on picket lines and so on and so forth.
Looking historically and looking at today, does it seem like the only way really to get people to be upset about violence in terms of a large number of people is that the violence needs to be particularly gruesome or particularly much more extreme than clearly it needed to be in any case, if in certain cases one could argue that it needed to be violent in the first place? Because it seems, I'm thinking particularly of Emmett Till during the Civil Rights Movement, was beaten so badly, but his mother insisted on having an open casket to show how gruesome his murder had been. And because of that, a lot of people responded. Whereas, potentially, had he been simply shot or something that wasn't as gruesome in any way as his body was in that, it may not have had that same effect, which, it's hard to think about, but at the same time, it seems historically that it's only with extreme, and in many cases visual violence that people respond as something that this needs to change. Is there another way or a better way, or historically do you think that it's only with these excessively violent, whether state actors or not, but these excessively violent issues that are presented in the public, that's when violence becomes too much?
I think historically this has quite often been the case, yes. I mean, as you probably know, I have a special interest in the history of France, and looking back over the history of France, it tends to be, leaving the Parisian attacks to one side for the moment, but it tends to be the very violent incidents which are remembered, in particular the Commune of Paris of 1871, when there were something like 25,000 people killed more or less in cold blood once the government decided to take back Paris. So I say they were more or less killed in cold blood, and these are the incidents that are remembered. Of course, the stakes, when people are killed, and I suppose in particular, and when they're killed in a very graphic and unequal way, not necessarily in combat, the stakes do rise. They tend to rise a great deal at these moments, and unfortunately, it does sometimes take the shedding of blood and what you might describe as martyrdom in order for issues to be taken very very seriously indeed. I mean, I would, and I do in one or two organisations I've been involved with, argue that violence would have to be in all circumstances the absolutely last resort. And I suppose and this is, as I said earlier, the sort of thing that Nelson Mandela used to argue, and I think this is still the correct way to approach things. it is very likely that in any serious, sustained struggle for rights or whatever else it might be, that there will be injuries and that there may be deaths as well, but that these should not be perpetrated by the rebels fighting for emancipation. But it is very likely sooner or later that there will be deaths in one form or another perpetrated by the people who are against the form of emancipation being pursued.
Well, I'm also thinking, I believe it's Steven Pinker who's arguing that the world is becoming less violent in one of his more recent books. And I think a lot of people can see this in the sense that there is a lot less physical fighting, it seems, when you think about a long historical progress, which is not to say that there's less violence if you want to include the suffering of people and the willful, I guess, neglect of people, because that's another thing. But it seems that within neoliberalism, a lot of the violence is done through neglect or through systems that are not particularly gruesome, in the sense that far less people are being tortured or brutally attacked, but many people are, for example, not able to afford healthcare and therefore suffering, or they're not able to afford food and shelter to the extent that they would live productive, healthy lives. So does this, I mean, in your research and in what you've looked at, does this mean that it would be harder to fight these issues, if you want to call it neoliberalism as just an overarching issue? Does it make it harder because there are less physical, clear signs that there is a perpetrator who is willfully, physically hurting people? Instead, there is just sort of a system that neglects large numbers of people. Does this mean that does this make it harder to fight for emancipation in this case?
Yes, I think it probably does. And that, yes, lots of interesting issues raised there. I mean, I have some sympathy for Steven Pinker's argument. It's a slightly complacent one, I must say, which I think is very unfortunate. But I have some sympathy for the idea that that there is less violence in some respects. Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about here, partly anyway, is what is sometimes described after John Galton as structural violence. In other words, violence which is, or early death, or death from malnutrition, which can of course be early as well, or sustained hardship and suffering, physical suffering over time. I think one thing is that if we look at structural violence, and structural violence has probably also diminished if we compare, the beginning of the 21st century with the beginning of the 20th century. If we stick to advanced capitalist countries or developed countries, quote unquote, for the moment, then I think there probably is a reduction of structural violence. Now, whether there is a reduction of structural violence now compared with 15 years ago, I'm certainly less persuaded. But I think perhaps more important, and this is why I say I think the Pinker argument is rather complacent. What's more important, I think, is that actually, particularly in the West, including in the US and Britain, of course, we have the capacity, the ability, the know-how to actually, well, let's say 99% eradicate structural violence. That would be possible, and it would. The people have argued this before. Of course, it would be possible also, given the resources in existence globally. It would also be possible to eliminate structural violence in the rest of the world. Let's say over the next decade. Now, in other words, yes, there's probably been a reduction. There are fewer people dying from famine, as I understand it, now than there were 30 years ago. But we're not going far enough. We're not going far enough. and we could do. And there are forces which are working against that equalization of experience, if I can put it like that. And perhaps, just as worrying, it's not impossible that there could be a tremendous setback politically, economically, if there was some sort of political and economic crisis, some sort of, for example, new form of fascism which took root in various different countries, which would mean that structural violence and indeed more conventional violence became once again more extreme. In other words, I don't think we can assume that the rather inadequate degree of reduction of structural violence and actual violence will necessarily carry on. And I think debating these sorts of issues is very necessary in order to try and ensure that that there is a continued reduction. There's just one more point on the amount of violence around. I was talking to some students the other day, and we were comparing the Iraq War, which of course the US and Britain were very much involved in, comparing that with the Vietnam War, and we looked. I forget the exact figures, but we looked them up. We were comparing the numbers of deaths of American, and in the case of Iraq, American, British, and various other countries, soldiers in the fight overseas, quote unquote, with Vietnam. And of course, the Vietnam War was hugely more lethal as far as American servicemen were concerned. In other words, there's a trend towards. And of course, with the advent of drones, which both of our countries are using as well, of course, that's an even more extreme example of where the country which is the more advanced economically is able to perpetrate violence, which is not particularly lethal as far as its own army is concerned. And obviously, if you compare that with the numbers of Iraqi and other people, including many, many thousands of civilians, of course, that's one thing. But this imbalance, I think, probably has led to, in part, to the terrorism that we've seen in the streets of America, Britain, France, and of course, far more in the Middle East. And this is one of the consequences, or partial consequences anyway, of these types of war. Ironically, I think it's probably one of the consequences, or partial consequences, of the sort of the perceived pacification of war. I think when Britain and America first invaded Iraq, it was described as a smart war. Because quite a lot of it was done by remote control from the air, and it seemed like that conventional warfare was beginning to be a thing of the past. So I just thought I'd mention that as a context as well.
Yeah, well, and one of the things I remember feeling reading the book, especially towards the end when you do talk about Iraq and the Middle East, is just the idea that the more history people are aware of, the more evidence-based history people are aware of, I think the less likely people would be able to say, this is a smart war, this is a good thing what we're doing, because it will so clearly lead to more violence down the road. It's just not as immediate as a confrontation where there's violence and then it seems to sort of go away. These things seem to last and in fact just fester and bubble up maybe decades later, as you sort of point out. But if you were to advise somebody who cares deeply about helping, however you want to phrase it, right, like world peace, emancipation of as many people as possible, just to try to push the world towards everyone being able to thrive as much as possible, What would you suggest they focus on in terms of the violence of today or the things that are happening, be that sort of structural or street level violence? If you were to advise somebody who wants to focus their efforts in a way that will make a difference, where do you see possible avenues?
I think probably wherever you can get involved and try and contribute to a struggle for more equality. You know, in so many circumstances, violence on the part of dominant powers and dominant people is allowed to take place because inequalities are allowed to exist and persist. So I think, you know, in a word, I know this is a huge sweeping generalization, but in order to struggle for the eradication of violence, it needs to go hand in hand with the eradication of inequality. And actually something, you know, the Me Too movement in relation to the sexual abuse of women and sexual harassment of women. You know, this is which is a very often a form of violence, of course. And this itself, you know, it's a very an issue which is very much in the news at the moment. And this is something which is not discussed, I think, is that, you know, of course the individual instances of sexual harassment are what are being focused on, quite understandably. But there's a huge issue of inequality, power inequality, which very often exists between men and women. And which exists far more generally as well within organizations, within families, within countries, between countries. And very often, in one way or another, this results in violence, either conventional violence, you know, actually, you know, somebody doing physical violence to someone else in as I say, in a sort of conventional way, conventionally defined way, or structural violence, which again is intimately bound up with the existence of profound inequalities.
Do you think that violence is inevitable? Do you think that the eradication of violence is something that we could work towards?
I think we have to. I mean, it's very often, I mean, almost everyone, whatever their political approach might be, would argue that violence is a bad thing. I mean, you know, various people have argued, well, through the centuries actually, that there is such a thing as just war, which is quite a troublesome argument, I think. But certainly, you know, even people who argue for just wars would argue that violence in itself was a very bad thing. And the question, of course, is all about when it's legitimate to use violence and when it's not legitimate. And that is the absolute nub of the question.
Is there anything that you see violence doing that we need to be more aware of? And what I mean by that is, as cultural contexts change and as technology changes with drones and other things, as you've mentioned, is there anything that you think we ought to look out for in terms of where violence or what kind of violence is going to be more and more important or more of an issue? Well,
certainly, you know, the use of drones, the use of cyber attack, which I know it's not only Russia who is working on it, of course, in relation to these sort of supposedly smart forms of attack. You know, these will have very, very traditional consequences of one kind or another. In other words, there's no such thing as a form of warfare which does not involve suffering. And in terms of large-scale warfare, including cyber attack or, of course, drones, very substantial forms of suffering. And I think one of the things which we in the West are experiencing partly, not entirely, but partly as a result of our activities in the Middle East is that there is no consequence-free way of waging a war. In other words, consequence-free on the population of the country perpetrating the war. And so, it's a very dangerous idea to believe that virtually consequence-free warfare can take place. And I think that's certainly one of the things to look out for.
Well, Nick, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today, and I definitely think that there is a lot more. There's probably an infinite amount of things we could discuss in terms of violence and what to do about it and how to deal with it. But your book, especially, is a really interesting take especially for me, who wasn't aware of some of the historical connections that you put together in terms of your arguments about violence in pursuit of emancipation. So I really appreciate you talking to me, and I just wanted to thank you for that.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you very much, Chris. It was a very, very interesting discussion. And thank you for putting together such an interesting series of questions. It was a great pleasure.